Thank you very much, David, and many thanks to the folks and organizers for Chicago Ideas Week for inviting me here today. I don't get to Chicago very often. I'm a native of Boston and was there yesterday, and hope my accent doesn't come out too much despite living in Washington for 21 years. Freedom House is the oldest human rights organization in the United States, founded in 1941 to confront four isms: fascism, Nazism, communism, but also isolationism in the United States, founded in the belief that threats to freedom elsewhere around the world would in fact redound to being threats to our own freedom here in the United States. And so Freedom House over the years has worked in supporting civil society, defending human rights activists. We also do advocacy work to raise the profile and importance of democracy, human rights, and freedom issues. We also do reports, including a report called Freedom in the World, that we've been issuing since 1972, in which we rank countries into free, partly free, and not free categories. For the past 8 years, we've seen a decline in freedom around the world. Not a precipitous drop, but where political rights and civil liberties in the 195 countries and 12 disputed territories have seen a decline rather than an increase. So freedom is on the decline, not on the march these years. One of the main reasons and culprits for this is Vladimir Putin's Russia. And Putin has presented, I would argue, one of the gravest threats that we face to freedom and democracy and human rights, not just inside Russia, but to his neighbors and elsewhere, including, following on Ambassador Ford's presentation, by arming, aiding, and abetting Bashar al-Assad's slaughter of the Syrian people. So how did we reach this point where we're at the gravest crisis, I would say, for Europe since World War II? Tensions between Russia and the United States, the gravest they've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have to realize that Putin's Russia sees moves by any of its neighbors to democratize, to westernize, to engage in deeper integration with Europe and the Western community as a threat. Putin, after all, oversees a terribly corrupt authoritarian regime that depends on building up this myth that the West is a threat. As a moth flies right by me. That must have been a Russian moth. Doesn't like what I'm saying. He actively tries to block democracy and human rights activities in his neighboring states. He certainly does it inside Russia, where many American organizations and international organizations have been kicked out of Russia. And we see Putin trying to extend this to his neighbors. After all, he fears that if a country like Ukraine were to democratize and move closer toward Europe, that would represent an alternative model to what he's tried to build in Russia, and that would be a threat to his hold on power. Staying in power is Putin's #1 objective. And so when Ukraine last year was prepared to sign agreements with the European Union on deeper and freer trade and association, Putin applied pressure to then President Viktor Yanukovych to renege on that agreement and not go forward. That then precipitated thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to turn out in the streets of Ukraine to protest Yanukovych's decision not to go with the EU and instead to side with Putin's Russia. Putin felt that he had to put a stop to this. He saw these protests in 2004 when Ukrainians protested against efforts to steal an election. Viktor Yanukovych was involved in that effort too. He also got spooked by the revolution a year before in Georgia in 2003, known as the Rose Revolution. He got scared again in 2011 with the movements in the Arab world, even if they have not turned out so well. Putin sees popular movements as a threat, and he worries that it will spread to Russia itself. He also simply can't believe that these movements are domestically driven, that they're indigenous. He ascribes the protests to efforts by the State Department, and having worked in the State Department for 8 years, I can tell you the State Department couldn't organize a protest on C Street just outside, let alone spawning a movement elsewhere around the world. So Ukraine represented a threat, and Putin needed to try to quell it as much as possible. Why does all this matter? First, Ukraine is a country of some 46 million people. It's a key to achieving the vision enunciated by George H.W. Bush decades ago of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Ukraine is a key part of that puzzle. Ukraine matters because what we saw first with Crimea, with the annexation, the first annexation by one European country of another since World War II, and then the invasion of other parts of Ukraine, we have seen the gravest security threat to Europe in decades. We see the countries such as China, Iran, watching what Russia can get away with. Our allies are watching how we respond to this crisis, to see whether we will support Ukraine, even though it is not a member of NATO, but also to see what we will do to bolster the defenses of NATO states that border Ukraine and Russia. Those countries, China and Iran, as well as other countries, are seeing what our reaction is to see if we will do something about it. Our allies are also watching us. They want to be reassured. They want to know that the United States and European member states are going to be there in their time of need. U.S. credibility is at stake in this case. European credibility is at stake in this case. There have been numerous treaties and memoranda that have been violated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In 1994, there was something called the Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons that it inherited from the breakup of the Soviet Union in exchange for Russia's, America's, and the UK's commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Russia, of course, has violated that memorandum. It's not a binding treaty, but it nevertheless was key to Ukraine's giving up its nuclear weapons. So this also matters in terms of nuclear weapons capability and aspirations. Countries are watching what Ukraine has gone through after giving up its nuclear weapons 2 decades ago, and may wonder, maybe we should keep our nuclear weapons as a guarantee against invasion by a bigger neighboring state. It also matters because more than 3,500 people have been killed in this crisis. The Malaysian airliner shot down July 17th led to the murder of 298 innocent civilians. At a certain point, I think we need to say enough is enough and we need to do something about this. So what to do? First, we need to realize that this is not a civil war. Ukraine was a peaceful country for decades since it acquired independence at the end of 1991. There was no real split in divisions and separatist movements in Ukraine. These were artificially promoted and fomented by Putin after Yanukovych fled power in February of this year. Ukraine went through a revolution in 2004 that I mentioned earlier, the Orange Revolution, that protested efforts to steal an election by Yanukovych. There was no violence in that revolutionary movement. The violence that occurred starting the end of last November, beginning of December, and then in particular in February, was unprecedented in Ukraine's independent history. And it was largely pushed by Putin, who urged Yanukovych to crack down on the protesters and to clear the square. We need to understand that sanctions, which the US and the EU have imposed on Russia, and they've been tough, hard-hitting sanctions, are not enough. They've been too slow, they've been too reactive. We have let Putin set the agenda rather than to try to act and preempt and prevent further Russian aggression. We respond to that aggression afterward with sanctions. And the latest round of sanctions, I would argue, that came about at the end of August would never have happened, at least from the EU perspective, had the Russian-supported forces not shot down that Malaysian airliner. That was a game changer for Europe in particular, and in particular for Germany, where it realized it had to do more. The sanctions that had been put in place were not enough. I've been a strong supporter and advocate for these sanctions. I do think they're critical, and I think they are having a serious impact on Russia's economy. Capital flight this year is already more than it was last year, close to $100 billion. We see the ruble dropping every single day. We see foreign investment being deterred. We see businessmen being arrested. We're seeing Putin act in fairly irrational ways. And yet the sanctions are not enough to change and affect Putin's decision-making and behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine. That's why I also think it's important to provide Ukraine with the military support that President Poroshenko asked for when he visited Washington September 17th, to enable Ukraine to defend itself. I'm not urging arming Ukraine so that it can go on the offensive. What I'm saying is Ukraine and its government has a responsibility to regain control over its own territory. It doesn't have sufficient means to do so. It needs help from the United States and from our NATO allies. Moreover, providing such military support, I would argue, would be a huge psychological boost for Ukraine, and it would be a blow for Putin. If we had sent in a dozen NATO aircraft in July or August, loaded with military equipment to help Ukraine defend itself, not to put soldiers on the ground, simply to allow Ukrainians to defend themselves against this Russian threat, I would argue Putin would have gone into shock. He does not want a conflict with NATO, and yet we continually provide gratuitous clarity, a phrase coined by the Washington Post, in making clear what we won't do. President Obama, after President Poroshenko's speech to the US Congress calling for military assistance, made it clear he was not going to provide that assistance. We have constantly made it clear what we won't do in this conflict. I would argue that that is a mistake. I want Mr. Putin to wonder, what might we do? How might we respond to this crisis? Rather than to telegraph to Putin what we won't do so that he thinks he has open season on Ukraine. His goal is to destabilize Ukraine. Crimea was easy for him. It was over in 2.5 weeks. It was relatively bloodless. His efforts in eastern Ukraine, by comparison, have been very bloody and very violent. And yet, we keep telling him what we won't do. And I would argue we need to stop doing that. We need to provide Ukraine with intelligence support so that it knows where the Russian threat is coming from. And we also have to understand that many of the forces, particularly in the early parts of this crisis, were Russian forces brought in from Russia onto Ukrainian territory. These were not locals. Now, the local population has suffered tremendously in places like Donetsk and Luhansk, and we have to sympathize with them. But it is the Kiev government's responsibility to reestablish and restore control, and I would argue we should be helping them do so. We do need to also try to contain further Russian aggression against other Russian neighbors. Moldova, which has an election coming up next month, very nervous about what Russia might do, particularly with the separatist region of Transnistria, where Russia has 1,200 troops, despite the Moldovan government's repeated requests for Russia to withdraw those forces. Georgia, which suffered a Russian invasion in 2008. Estonia, a member of NATO, which was the target of a cyber attack by Russia in 2007. All these countries, all these neighbors, are very worried about further Russian moves and further Russian aggression. We need to help them, bolster them as much as possible. I do give President Obama and NATO credit for beefing up NATO defenses among NATO member states that border Russia. We need to understand that the nature of regimes matters. How a regime treats its own people is often indicative of how it will behave in terms of foreign policy. And Vladimir Putin doesn't give a damn about the human rights of Russians inside Russia, and he certainly doesn't care about Russians living in Ukraine, but he uses that as an excuse, a cover, to invade a neighboring state. The nature of regimes matters. The countries we have problems with are not democracies. That's why promoting and supporting democracy, something we've been doing for decades, is in our national interest. It's not just consistent with our values, it's in our national interest to see the spread and growth of democracy. It can be messy. It can be incredibly messy. But it's also premature to conclude that some countries that are trying to go through a democratic transition have failed. It takes a long time, as we ourselves know. We need, and I'll end with this, to give the term unacceptable real meaning. When we say something is unacceptable, then we can't go about business as usual. We need to do something about it. And so whether it was those pictures that Robert was showing about Syria, when we say that's unacceptable but don't do anything about it, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine where we say it's unacceptable and we have done something about it, we really need to give meaning to the term unacceptable. And that's something I want to leave you with to think about, not just in the current crisis that I've been talking about, but for future cases, sadly, that will materialize. And when we say something's unacceptable, let's together figure out what we do about it. Thank you very much.